But you read the title, right? I got a lot of stuff wrong, man. Basically, one video of mine was like completely wrong. It was outdated information.
What it specifically was about was the claim of like we could see if humans or other organisms had made it to the new world by like the DNA admixture and stuff. And the video claimed we wouldn't be able to see that when we would.
Boom. Okay, let's share some receipts and see what they tell us about this retraction and dedunking's behavior in general. Welcome to Ancient Puzzles. Hi everyone. I'm dropping this bomb before continuing with the video I was working on, which will certainly take me long to publish. As some of you know, I was working on a video response to the ignorant claims Mr. Dan the Dedunker made back in April. I told him some of the obvious issues, and Zeke Darwin as well, but he got upset with me and accused me of having ulterior motives. He was informed that I was going to reply someday, but he initially didn't take that seriously, probably because it's obvious the response wasn't even a project. However, at the end of July 2024, I told him I have stuff to show to the public, even though I still had a lot of work to put it together in a video, and a few days after this, it's when he decided to private the video and announce a retraction. He claims the reason he cared about this is the podcast in which Zeke recently appeared, but I didn't believe him and called him a liar. I watched his retraction and had the opportunity to talk with him, and I admit I was less confident about that after this, especially considering Dan was apparently generous regarding something I'll cover in a moment. But I've been revising his claims, and there are definitely good reasons to conclude he has not been honest. So without further ado, let's jump into it.
Maybe Zeke was expecting me to take his word for it, because I also used to be friends with this unnamed third party, but he had lost my faith. I didn't give him any credibility. After like a month prior to that, I just had gotten to the point where it was like there's so many things that are just like clearly obvious. Like he rejects all evidence that doesn't coincide with team debunkers. So I just like it was pretty clear to me that he was like, if you're not at least a little bit open-minded, I don't really give two shits about what you have to say about this stuff. No offense. But that was my fault because he was right in what he said. Just like I was right just like Zeke got stuff wrong about my video because he didn't trust me enough to even look at it. So he's out there just spewing falsehoods. I didn't trust this dude, so I ended up leaving a falsehood up quite a bit longer than I should have.
Seems like Dan had a terrible opinion of me, and his story makes sense in this context, but he never told me that, and we already discussed the topic of his video 1 or 2 days before it was published, and everything was normal. I'll talk about this in more detail in the longer video, but the reasons why I was saying that have nothing to do with the arguments Dan used in his video. The short explanation is that both ancient and modern DNA studies normally take into account the archaeological and historical evidence, even though that doesn't mean it's impossible the findings can challenge previous conclusions, since there are of course lots of things only geneticists can see. And the other important aspect to consider is the level of research that has been crazy in Europe and West Eurasia in general, with lots of modern and ancient samples available, but not even close in the other world regions. So I'd say that right now, the lack of archaeological evidence has more weight than DNA alone to conclude the so-called lost advanced civilization is very unlikely to have existed, but at the end of the day, multiple fields contribute to improve our understanding of the past.
The up until now unnamed third party is Ancient Puzzles, and he, like I said, is a former friend of mine. Well, he's been working on a response video to me, and he told me as much, but I assumed that it was my Flint Dibble video that he was going to respond to. I just assumed that that would be the one that most people were going to take shots at. The couple other people that are talking about doing it are trying to take shots at those videos. So anyway, I assumed that's what was going on. I was wrong. He was targeting the DNA video that I just privated. Well, That sucks for him because he's put a lot of effort in. He's been talking to me about this for like a fucking month, man. So, and I know how hard and frustrating research can be. So if he's put a month into doing it and then I just am like, "Hup, gotcha, buddy." That's basically a rug pull to him for like a month of his extracurricular activities working on his YouTubes and social media crap. And even though he's been being a downright asshole to me lately, against my better judgment, I'm going to not point out any of the stuff in my video that I got wrong, except for to say that I was just wrong. It was wrong, like I said earlier. Now, I looked into it and saw, like I said, there was the one thing that I'm pretty sure is still accurate. When I did my research, that was the one thing that seemed to still stand on its own. So I could make this video. And if Ancient Puzzles video sucks, I will make this video. But he's been working on it for a while. Maybe it won't suck. Maybe I'll even share it. We'll see. But at any rate, there's this little icon thing of a job. You can find him if you want. Again, I guess is against my better judgment.
He acknowledges I was right and chooses to wait until I'm done with the video, even considering the possibility that it might be good. I'm not sure if he's going to wait when he finishes watching this video, but he almost convinced me with that. Next we have this.
In a video that I uploaded about DNA not being able to disprove Atlantis, pretty much every point that I made in it was wrong, except for what I said that when they test the modern indigenous populations, they assume any old world DNA they find is from the post-colonial era, not area. That seems to still be the case. Beyond that, everything that I said pretty much was wrong.
At first I thought he at least had the balls to defend part of what he claimed, but you will see that's not exactly what he said in the DNA video. We'll get to that, and well, I don't think Dan even cared if this position is right or wrong. Who knows? But I can tell you for sure he didn't put time and effort into checking anything or creating the story he told us in this video. Also, Dan sent me a copy of the video he took down, which definitely makes my job easier, and I know others would not have done this, so it is fair to acknowledge this. I had relevant stuff in my PC, but not the video in question, and I admit I should have downloaded the content since the beginning, although watching on YouTube had another advantage.
Hold up, wait a minute.
I told him, though, that I still wasn't sure about his motivation to retract those claims, and that I have a negative opinion about him, not only for his DNA video, but also his behavior during the last months, and now seems like he will never send content to a critic again. He's of course free to act like this, but I'll keep saying the same thing. If he wants to show integrity, it is basic to not hide claims, and it's worth noting that the first time he retracted a video, he did not delete it. He argues that he would be misleading his viewers if the video was still public, but that wasn't a problem more than a year ago when he discussed the lack of hieroglyphs in pyramids, and we can still watch his short video and the retraction.
The simplest way to demonstrate that the 3 pyramids at Giza were not intended to be tombs is to highlight the lack of inscriptions.
He knows it's okay to do it this way, since the Archaeological Prospection Journal did not delete the Gunung Padang paper they retracted, but for some reason, Dan's preferences changed. I know he's likely to make up excuses for not deleting the short, like when I confronted him for complaining about Emperor Tiger Star deleting a video Dan responded to, and he told me it was because he wanted him to upload a retraction. Dan pretends this implies more integrity, ignoring that some retractions can be dishonest, but let's see first what he told us about the short.
The first one is, I gave you guys some wrong information. On my video about the interior of the pyramids, I said that no other place that a pharaoh was intended to be buried was devoid of funerary inscriptions, and that's not true. The first dynasty mastabas and the mastaba for Shepseskaf all have no inscriptions. Now they're mastabas, and there's a lot of debate about it, and they're widely separated in time frame except for the one from Shepseskaf, but it is debated heavily as to what exactly is going on there. So I don't think it undermines my position on the pyramids not being tombs.
It's pretty obvious he can't use the lack of funerary inscriptions to demonstrate the pyramids were not intended to be tombs. So yeah, I'm afraid it undermines his position. Maybe he really believed it wasn't as serious to remove the video, or maybe he just forgot. But considering Dan claims he doesn't want to misinform his viewers, and now says removing the content is the way to go, it seems to me he has a lot of work to do, since he will have to remove this video and many others. And well, Dan's memory is supposedly very bad, and he uses that as an excuse when necessary, but you will also see that sometimes this is simply not credible. Let's explain this accurately. I requested a copy of the video, which he refused to send me at first, but he changed his mind and then offered it to me. I made clear before he sent me the video that it's basic to not hide his claims, and that what he was doing wasn't an incredible thing, even though I know others wouldn't do it. I also told him I still had to watch his retraction before drawing conclusions about his honesty, and knowing this, Dan still chose to send me the video, and I am glad he did, because it really was the right thing to do. My opinion about him remained more or less the same, and he didn't like it, and now if he doesn't do something like this again, it is apparently my fault, but I never promised I would significantly change my mind, so it's not my problem if that's what he expected. Dan thinks I did not treat him like a human being, which is highly subjective, because all I can say is I told him the truth, and that he had enough information to make a decision. Seems like for him this was about helping me or not, instead of deciding if his claims would be available to anyone who wants to know exactly what he said. He literally told me in private that the fact he sent me the video should prove beyond a shadow of a doubt he was not trying to hide anything or mislead anyone, but let's move on, and at the end of the video, I will demonstrate that's basically false. He acknowledges there was a disagreement between us, but pretends he couldn't know the topic of my response, because he says I didn't specify it, even though I provided additional details in the next reply, related to the moment in question. For context, our first interactions on social media were not friendly, but that was long before April 2024, and we eventually became friends. We still disagreed about many things, and that's what he uses to say he was referring to a different disagreement, but before he published that video, I never told him he disappointed me and that I couldn't respect what he did. That's the disagreement, a moment that has nothing to do with the rest of our disagreements, and we have not been friends since then. Plus, I was one of the last skeptics about the existence of the so-called lost advanced civilization to still defend him, and he knows this, so I'm not sure how is it possible he had something different in mind.
And there was a dude, unnamed third party, who was just like running around yelling at me, being pretty much an asshole, to be honest with you.
This is not true. As my comment says, I pointed out he didn't have the knowledge to make a video on that topic, but I did not attack him, rather the opposite, and Zeke Darwin in April noted he got upset during our discussion. I was polite, but he still did to me what he does to many people who tell him whatever he doesn't like, basically calling me biased or something similar, and now he also includes Zeke Darwin for exposing he misrepresented him and what happened. That's important, because since I told him he disappointed me, the way I've been posting about his stuff on social media has been very different, so that's why the details I gave him mattered. What he says I told him 1 month earlier, by the way, doesn't mention any detail, or if I was already working on it, and my advice to anyone making videos about his content is of course to not say anything. He ended up blocking me, as well as most of his critics, because apparently he got upset after I pointed out that removing content is problematic if others want to know what he claimed, and he also didn't like I needed some time to verify his story. Dan has claimed this, but the fact he doesn't have the same opinion as me on the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis was not a big problem, and not even the last thing we discussed before the relevant upload. He in fact was throwing the Dixon wood at me, because he didn't like the information I shared with him, and I made clear I respected he had a different opinion about that, but not the DNA video and his unwillingness to listen. I admit Dan doesn't say our last discussion was about this controversial hypothesis, but he was definitely twisting my words, because I was clearly referring to the issues of his DNA video. That's what I wanted him to understand, because I initially didn't think he wanted to lie, but his reaction was highly suspect, and since then, he has produced a lot of content that deserves to be corrected as much as the video in question. Also, I find this quite strange. Note he decides to remove content that he says it was one of his least viewed videos and minimizes how serious, and also ridiculous, his claims were. But he felt the need to say he got a lot of stuff wrong, curiously a few days after I told him what I was doing, along with a very problematic claim affecting Flint Dibble, that knowing it was not correct, he still waited 1 month to retract it.
So that kind of lie, it pisses a guy off. So I figured I would just let Flint see for a little bit how it feels to have something out there that just is a little bit wrong, and it sucks. So after I found out it was wrong, I just ignored it for a little over a month. And I think it might have worked.
He has attacked me, and he has personally been stalking me by making tons of videos about me and lying about me and knowingly lying about me. He knows he's lied about me being he accused me of being a researcher at Dartmouth University who handled indigenous remains. He did this both on Twitter and YouTube. He knew I was not affiliated with Dartmouth College. At that time, I taught at Dartmouth for 1 year. I taught in the classics department, and I was never even in person at Dartmouth. It was during the pandemic. It was entirely online. I've never even been to Dartmouth College, not even once in my life.
So I'll go ahead and retract it now because I think he's a little bit upset.
It's pretty obvious what's wrong with that, let alone there are many other things he did not admit. So we either trust Dan doesn't see any of this, or simply conclude he doesn't want to. But Dan knew he had to retract that claim about Flint Dibble, and the DNA video was clearly as important as that for him. So I'm not sure why we have to believe he didn't know the video I was targeting. Maybe he was just acting like he didn't know, and that the video was not a big deal, because that's basically what he did for approximately 1 month before retracting what he said about Flint. These falsehoods, by the way, have not even been deleted, and that also applies to other uploads, as I said, like the video referenced in his latest retraction, where Dan's story on how he decided to retract the claims is curiously not inconsistent.
Wait a minute! Who are you?
There's another video he uploaded about the harm caused by archaeology that it's only available if you search this post on social media, in which Dan told me he didn't really want to make, claiming he wasn't serious because the goal was to give a lesson, and I admit I never questioned him for removing that one. Dan looked honest to me, and I was not familiar with the things he discussed there, but it's weird he took the time to make a video knowing he would have to take it down, and also the fact he argued a lot with archaeologist Jeffrey T. Lewis about the content. Maybe he was telling the truth, or maybe he was just trying to avoid responsibility for his actions. I can't say for sure, but now that I know more things, the situation is certainly suspicious. The content is left or removed in an arbitrary manner, and Dan published more wrong stuff after the DNA retraction while boosting ancient epoch, some of it already debunked, but still available on his YouTube channel. So it's a joke he pretends removing his DNA video proves he cares about misinformation, since all it demonstrates is an anomalous behavior when checking what he did in the other retractions, even the most recent one, and I highly recommend you to check this video by archaeologist Jeffrey T. Lewis, linked in the video description. And it's not over yet, because there are still more inconsistencies showing the DeDunker definitely lied. Dan claims he started revising his DNA stuff after he watched a podcast featuring Zeke Darwin, only available in this YouTube channel. So if Zeke did not share it on social media, he wouldn't have known about this. Zeke shared the podcast the 23rd of July for the first time, but mentioned it the 24th in a different post as well, which is when I told Dan I have some interesting things to show to the public. I informed him after briefly discussing his video with Zeke, and he even reposted what I was going to address the same day, but Dan, who had no problem to notice the podcast, conveniently missed this. Let's summarize what we've seen so far before we continue. Dan announced his retraction a few days after I told him I have some receipts to show. The DNA video and the other one on the harm caused by archaeology are the only ones he decided to remove, both under strange circumstances. He acknowledges I was right about something he does not specify, but don't worry, I will tell you exactly what it is. Dan pretends our discussion about his DNA video was more or less the same as what happened in other occasions, ignoring I informed him about how disappointed I was, and that we have not been friends since then. I replied to his comment mentioning he disagreed with me, and the details should be enough for him to know I was referencing that moment. Again, I wasn't an asshole as he says, rather the opposite. Dan can't demonstrate that his opinion of me was as terrible as he claims before publishing the video, since our previous exchange on the topic was cordial, and I had to tell him I couldn't respect what he did after discussing his content. I posted what I'll be covering in my video on social media, and Zeke reposted it the same day I told him I have stuff to show to the public. Zeke shared the podcast on social media, and this is basically how Dan saw it. Finally, he sent me a copy of the video, but unlike what he says, that doesn't necessarily prove he's been honest. It's definitely possible that Dan knew what I was going to address, either cause he understood it when I told him, or cause he saw my post highlighting the points covered in the response, but I agree more evidence is needed to conclude he 100% lied about his motivation to retract the claims and remove the video. It's funny that Dan claims to find missing data and attack scientists who don't agree with him at all, but ironically, he's hidden crucial data to solve this case, which I'm very lucky to have and happy to share with you all. The podcast was published the 23rd of July, so if we're generous and assume he noticed it that day, he is claiming he recognizes there are problems in his DNA video, no earlier than that date. The day after he published the video, both me and Zeke discussed it with Dan, and the result was he didn't want to see any problem, and 2 weeks later he didn't even care if people thought his video was bad. But Dan was very aware of something relevant more than 2 months before the podcast was published, and he did not private the video and announce a correction.
Mamma mia!
The evidence for this exists, and this time I didn't need to request it, so let's see how is it possible I have it. I've been accused by one of his fans of having done nothing in months to correct the video, but that is not true. Dan was informed about some of the obvious issues only a few hours after he published it, and I have done a lot of work since then, but having a full-time job and a family means I can only make content before I go to sleep, and not every day. I'm using AI voice to record this video, as well as my last upload, basically because doing the voiceovers myself is very difficult, and this saves me time. And yes, speaks English far better than me, but it still takes time to achieve this result, and the process is sometimes even more difficult when terrible updates are released. On the other hand, videos like the one I made on the origins of Europeans require a lot of time and effort, and I literally had to use a just paste link, because that was the only way to include all the sources in the video description. Writing a script when working with a huge amount of data is very difficult, and addressing Dan's claims requires exactly that, because it's important to explain it in a way everybody can understand and portray the science as accurately as possible. Once the script was almost completed, I decided to check the comment section of that video, basically to see how Dan was handling the situation, and I found a couple of comments that were interesting to me and captured them. I never imagined, though, the importance of this. On July 7th, this comment was already 2 months old, and sorry for the words in Spanish, but that's how my phone captured this stuff, so keep in mind this doesn't mean 2 minutes ago, it means 2 months ago. We can see Dan thinks the evidence is not easy to find, and brings something that doesn't apply to all the ancient populations that have been identified, and that makes absolutely no difference, because it's pretty obvious he understands that today, we could definitely find the DNA evidence of a widespread lost advanced civilization in the skeletal record, assuming of course it really existed. His video was trying to show that the scientists who work in this field would simply assume the DNA originating very far from a specific region to be the result of recent admixture, and you can see here that what he told me in April is not the same thing he was telling this viewer. According to his logic, it was impossible to find proof unless things were done differently, and not even ancient DNA would help. So how is it possible no retraction was announced, when this was one of the big mistakes present in the video? Here's the other comment, which you can clearly see it was at least 1 month old. Basically, because I took a picture of the screen on the 6th of July, it's not a screenshot, and Dan pretty much relied on his argument that the problem is in the Americas, having previously admitted the other aspect. So Dan's story on how he decides to revise his DNA claims, once again is not consistent, because he already understood important stuff before the podcast was published and shifted his position, but instead of announcing a retraction, he tried to confuse his viewers. His reaction was better with this guy, and he might say it's because of what he describes in these posts, but again, I did not insult Dan or anything like that. I was respectful when I discussed the video with him, not accusing him of lying, bias, or whatever you can imagine, and he still did not admit anything, which is exactly the same that happened to Zeke. Not happy with that, in the retraction he completely made up I was an asshole, while omitting it was actually him, but the key thing here is that in 2 different comments, Dan tells us it all started with the podcast, which is what he shows in his video of course, and we all now know that this is also not true. He's never acknowledged his viewers, and I guess that as usual, he can say he doesn't remember these comments, and even add he realized more things besides that, but the reality is he admitted what he refused to admit in April, and it's not credible at all that he forgot it. It's important to remark that in his first post on social media, he only mentioned a big mistake without specifying which one it is, and in his video, he said it was all wrong except the part on the Americas. There is no room for interpretation here, because Dan has acknowledged I was right, and I only discussed with him what has to do with the archaeological specimens and the ancestry of Native Americans. I use the Solutreans as an example, or what can be inferred when we have samples of Upper Paleolithic Siberians. So part of what I told him he now accepts it, but keeps believing it's not relevant when it comes to the Americas. To put it simply, Dan cannot claim that accepting we can find the genetic evidence in the skeletal record is not the same thing I was trying to explain to him, and I have demonstrated he understood that way earlier than he said, but unlike now that he at least has the decency to admit I was right, he acted like it was not a big deal, trying to confuse, and not announcing a retraction. He had no intention to concede his video was a complete disaster when he posted these comments, so being aware of one of the major problems clearly did not motivate the retraction. He already knew I was right 2 months before the podcast was published and made clear in the other comment that he thinks the problem is how things are done in the Americas, even though who knows if he still believes the situation would affect both ancient and modern individuals, or only the latter, but this possible difference is irrelevant to discern the reasons behind his actions. What matters is his position did not drastically change when he announced the retraction, not even when he published it, because I know the other mistakes present in the part he retracted, and they're not as relevant to his argument, but definitely tell us his knowledge on the subject matter was very limited, and also that he wasn't up to date with the latest discoveries. Mr. Dan the Dedunker knew I was addressing that video. That's what made the difference to remove and retract the claims, and yes, I know many people will still defend him, but even according to his own logic, the truth is we shouldn't believe him. I recommend you to check Zeke Darwin's channel, TikTok, and social media, so you can see how Dan had problems to admit Zeke took the time to explain him some things back in April. What he mentioned in the podcast, by the way, was more or less the same he already told him, but Dan curiously decided to revise his content thanks to that video, which doesn't make any sense, and we already know it's not true. Dan didn't want to admit my response was the motivating factor, and the podcast was the best excuse he could use, but with Zeke he found another solution that let's see if it could be valid to solve his current problem. The Dedunker was confronted by Zeke with receipts of their discussion, showing Dan liked, and even replied to some comments, and his defense was he didn't remember these interactions, saying also that sometimes he likes posts without reading them, and that he's honest because he didn't cover his tracks by unliking or deleting comments, I guess, since he not only liked what Zeke posted, he replied as well. But by privating the video, all the YouTube comments are gone. So now we have to believe he didn't remember these comments, he forgot he changed his position, and that he didn't do this to cover his tracks, which was certainly convenient to say whatever he wanted in regards to the moment he becomes aware of the issues, since it's impossible to justify he didn't announce a retraction earlier.
Stop! He's already dead.
We're almost done, don't worry. But Dan also complained about Zeke apparently thinking he was dishonest since the very beginning with the video, even though Zeke is pretty sure he never accused him of that. So let's see what we have here.
He decided that I'd release that crap as a lie, right? That's basically what it was. He assumed that my video was deliberately made to misinform people in order to forge a false narrative. And
the amount of lies Dan told us since his DNA adventure started is so big that we all can understand he doesn't remember some things. Seems like Dan deleted the post announcing his new video, meaning the subsequent comments posted there are now gone, but he forgot about the previous conversation I mentioned earlier, where something relevant went unnoticed. Same as Dan claimed the way things are currently done makes impossible to find the DNA evidence of the alleged lost advanced civilization, he also made clear it's not possible to debunk it with DNA, which is certainly consistent and basically what he said in his video. But Dan knew he was in no position to teach about how geneticists work, yet he couldn't resist to release that crap as a lie, since he probably thought most of his viewers don't know anything about DNA, and his stuff was apparently debunking the debunkers, while pretending to show something questionable supposedly done by an entire field. The thing is that a few hours before releasing the video, having claimed the day earlier there's no way to debunk his beloved lost advanced civilization with DNA, Zeke asked him a question, and something magical happened. The impossible was no longer impossible, just difficult, and what mattered wasn't how geneticists research their stuff, or the tools available, but the amount of DNA gathered for study.
what?
I started this video saying Dan made ignorant claims, and yes, I still think he was clueless about most of what he discussed, but at the very least, he perfectly knew he didn't do his due diligence, and still decided to make confident statements for a gotcha, which is blatantly dishonest considering his video was scripted, and of course, what he said in the last relevant comment before publishing the content was not included in the video, rather the opposite.
We could have smoking gun evidence, piles of it, of out-of-place DNA that proves the existence of Atlantis, but they are throwing it out because they assume that it came over post-1492. And this is reality. Again, you might think that I'm full of it, but you can go dig into it a bunch. Even Wikipedia knows this is the case. And this is a rule worldwide, but it's easiest to show in the Americas. Piles of it, of out-of-place DNA that proves the existence of Atlantis, but they are throwing it out. And this is a rule worldwide. And this is a rule worldwide. And this is a rule worldwide. I did not deliberately misinform anyone.
There is clear evidence that Dan only cared about painting a narrative he could easily attack, otherwise he would have included what he replied to Zeke in the video. But having the possibility to do so, he obviously chose to publish his content claiming the opposite. There is also no doubt about the fact he moved the goalposts months later, both in the YouTube comments and the retraction, basically pretending that the problem is only the way things are done in the Americas, which is not what he said in the video he removed. The related short published 3 days after the DNA video is less specific, and some might think his main claim was about how the samples are tested in the Americas, but whether this is a real issue or just something Dan wants to be true, it's not difficult to see he was simply extrapolating from that.
They won't find the genetic evidence because they throw it out. Click here for more.
It seems to me that the Dedunker was projecting, as he accused geneticists of excluding DNA based on mere assumptions, yet he's the only one who has done something similar, Actually, even worse. Acknowledging the ancient DNA in the first half of the video, but then excluding it in his conclusions, which was completely absurd. Dan doesn't lie when he says he doesn't remember some comments. I think it's obvious that in August, he didn't remember what he replied to Zeke on the 7th of April, because if he did, I highly doubt I would have the video now, and I admit I missed that comment despite the fact I was mentioned in the conversation, and I also imagine Zeke is going to be very surprised when he watches this. Dan didn't know he revealed his true intentions by accident, and yes, it's also incredible that we didn't see this problem when we discussed the video with him, but the other comments he posted in April were not like this one, and if we had confronted him about it, who knows if we would have any other evidence now to prove his dishonesty. Anyways, it's important to remark that the fact he doesn't remember specific comments, or realize their implications, doesn't necessarily mean the same applies to other things he said, let alone forgetting his opinions about anything, which I'm afraid is impossible to believe.
With no memory of what went before. And I suspect, I really do, that that's what we are. We're a species with amnesia. We're children who've forgotten our own parents.
I love my mommy!
Don't cry, sweetie.
The Dedunker is not as smart as he thinks he is, and certainly not meticulous, and I wonder what research he's done on the Americas to believe what he said in the retraction is accurate, because pretending that papers proving him wrong support his position was honestly ridiculous, although we're getting used to it. I'll cover that in more detail in the other video. What matters now is Dan knew I was right way earlier than he said, and that he wasn't honest publishing that video. So what other YouTubers do with their content is not going to change it, but it's not hard to imagine why he was defending that standard. Hopefully, most people now understand the importance of having the claims available.
Professors, as you have no doubt guessed by now, I am an alternate historian. As a matter of fact, I happily call myself a pseudoscientist as I form a hypothesis, research it enough to satisfy myself, and then put that claim out into the world. By not following the same rigorous processes that an archaeologist would, I am engaging in a form of pseudoarchaeology.
It's fantastic what you're doing!
With these standards, Dan can't lecture scientists on anything, and it's not surprising that his content got worse and worse, even to the point of lying. He knew his DNA video was full of BS and didn't work as he expected, so he decided to make a move before I could explain the problems in detail. Yes, Dan saw an opportunity to portray himself as someone who really owns his mistakes, while minimizing the impact of my response, and he basically did what was convenient for him, not the audience. He almost convinced me, even when describing some things inaccurately, but the YouTube comments I captured, added to the multiple contradictions I found, are definitely more than enough to conclude he's a liar.
I defy anyone out there to find a single statement I've made that is a lie. And a lie is a knowing untruth.
Yeah.
As far as I know, I have never, ever told knowingly an untruth. What a stupid thing to do that would be.
And that doesn't happen to me.
I'm not sure if Hancock will ever watch this, but to team up with this individual is not the best way to show us he's honest, and Joe Rogan should really think about who conned him, since the arguments used against Flint do not demonstrate he wanted to lie at all, unlike Mr. Dan the Dedunker, the only proven liar here. He couldn't predict I would ask for a copy of the video, and after rejecting my request, he thought he could use that for his own benefit as well, and he of course exaggerated how good his action was, because there would be no need to request him anything if the video was still available, matching what he did in his previous retraction. He also knew I was almost done with the script, which means I could definitely reconstruct what he said, but it would have taken me more time. Last but not least, since he said this publicly and in our last private conversation, I want to make clear that my opinion about Dan was already very negative before the Joe Rogan debate featuring Graham Hancock and Flint Dibble, and the proof is here. What came after the DNA video made it even worse, But there is no doubt about the fact I told him he disappointed me before the debate, not after. We even talked about what would happen in the debate, and we both agreed that Flint was more likely to lose for various reasons, so that shows none of what he says holds water, and it's probably part of the argument to justify he thought I was targeting his content on Flint. In short, there are lots of inconsistencies here, so if Dan thought I would just ignore them because he was supposedly trying to be nice and help, I'm afraid there was no chance. He at least did something right sending the video, although it's too bad the reason had nothing to do with being transparent regarding what he claimed. He was more interested in trying to make people believe he's a saint, hoping nobody would know how dishonest he is in reality, but thanks to the fact I was there scrutinizing his stuff, and others gathered receipts as well, he failed miserably. Dan pretends to be something he's not, and accuses others of lying for far less than what he does. He's obviously a fraud, but even if for some weird reason you're one of those who refuses to accept he's a liar, it is undeniable that very often he says things that are clearly not true, which still means he's not trustworthy, but that is of course up to you. As for the video he sent me, it provides a good base to dive into the science and explain popular misconceptions, so I will still do it, and I encourage him to correct whatever he thinks he got wrong. Having brought this to your attention, I promise you will see me discussing a lot of DNA stuff when the longer video is finished someday, although it will certainly take me a lot of time. So sorry for the delay, but it will be worth the wait. Please drop a like, leave a comment, and consider subscribing if you haven't yet. All the best to you all. See you next time.